All right, well, welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Elliot Nethercutt. I am a Principal Regulatory Policy Specialist with the Center for Partnerships and Innovation within NARUC. This training has been made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. So last week we held our first two courses on this series. And that was a collaboration between NARUC and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We dug into a wide array of topics focused on resource adequacy. If you missed those, they're posted on our website, the same website you used to register for the course today. On Tuesday, we covered variable resources, capacity, balancing reserves. We talked about implications of baseload retirements. We heard from MISO on their evolving planning studies. And then we closed with a look at resource adequacy developments in the Western Interconnection, including their new resource adequacy program. And then on Thursday, we explored interregional impacts of different resource availability, specifically hydro output in the West. We talked about regional planning considerations and grid forming inverter models. We explored the interplay between resource adequacy and resilience. And then we closed out with a look at how energy storage could be used as a transmission asset. So I'll encourage you all to take a look at our website if you haven't. We had some excellent presenters from PNNL and other experts across the industry. And we also had 7 additional courses on the website. If you're interested in those, we had a series earlier this year, and then we had 4 more courses we did in 2021. And again, the presentations and the recordings are available for download. Before we get started today, I want to reiterate that this entire effort has been put together with you all in mind, with consideration for the regulatory community. We want to ensure that NARUC can provide you all with the tools and useful information as you all navigate the ongoing energy transition in your respective states. So I'd also like to thank Dr. Seal and the many others at LBNL who were really instrumental in putting this together. If you have any feedback or suggestions or would like to learn a little more about what NARUC is doing in this space, please go ahead and reach out. My email's at the bottom of the screen here. So let's just take a look at the agenda and the format and some logistics for today. We are excited to hear from 4 distinguished presenters. They're all experts in their respective subject areas. Dr. Seal and I will introduce each of them before they start their respective presentations. And while they're presenting, please go ahead and use that Q&A feature, put in any questions. Depending on the type of questions you ask, we'll attempt to address any clarifying questions as we go, but we'll hold the more substantive or technical questions until the end of each presentation. So first, we're going to hear from Rob Gremlich with Grid Strategies. He will sort of set the stage for today's course. He's going to lay out the foundation on transmission planning and interconnection processes. Then we'll hear from Dr. Joe Seal. He's going to walk through a presentation, and you'll walk away with a better understanding of how BPS interconnection queues have evolved, specifically how the speed and costs associated with those processes have changed over the past 2 decades. We'll step away for a short 10-minute break, and we'll come back for a presentation on the marginal value of transmission and wholesale markets from Dr. Julie Mulvaney-Kemp. And then we'll wrap up with an overview of Berkeley Labs' I2X efforts. If you haven't heard about those efforts, they were announced in June of 2022. There's been some terrific discussions and informative webinars this year centered around reforming interconnection processes throughout the country. So Dr. Will Gorman is going to walk us through that effort, and we'll hear specifically about the roadmap they introduced a couple months ago. So Dr. Seal, did I miss anything? Do you want to add any remarks before I introduce Mr. Gremlich?
No, that sounds great. I just wanted to
reiterate.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So just wanted to reiterate
still on mute.
We can hear. I think, Elliot, your sound is off. I'm not sure how to communicate that to you.
I will just briefly talk, and then maybe Elliot can
you're
figure
still
out
on
his
mute.
sound. So
far as I can
I
tell.
just wanted to
Um,
say thank you all very much for inviting us, and we look forward to presenting some of our research today. And I think with that, I'll leave it and talk to. I hope that Elliot can take over now.
Should I just go ahead then?
okay, I think we maybe I'm the only one who couldn't hear you. So anyway, hopefully you got your remarks in. I'll go ahead and introduce Rob now. Rob Bramlich is the founder and president of Grid Strategies, which provides expert input to state commissions, consumer groups, renewable energy associations, grid operators, private companies, national labs, and others on bulk power transmission and market topics, mostly related to reliable, low cost, and low carbon power systems. Rob was formerly Senior Vice President and Interim CEO at the American Wind Energy Association. He was an economic advisor to FERC Chairman Pat Wood III and a senior economist at PJM. Rob has a BA with honors in economics from Colby College and a master's of public policy from UC Berkeley. So Rob, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elliot and the LBNL team and NARUC, and thanks for everybody for coming today. Interconnection is a hot topic and a very important one, and it's very helpful to inform everybody as much as possible about what's going on, and I'll do my best with the background Elliot described. Again, it's Rob Gramlich, Grid Strategies, and we focus on the transmission system and bulk power issues. I've been working on that for 30 years, including 8 years at FERC. And I was there for FERC Order 2003 in the same year, working for the chairman on that order. And I'll give a little bit of that history and sort of try to explain some context of how we got to the point where we are in interconnection, and lay some groundwork for the excellent presentations from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. They're doing very helpful research in this area. So I'm going to start here on this kind of industry structure slide. A little bit busy, but on the left, it's just important to keep in mind that I'm guessing we have regulators from a variety of states, and we have a variety of industry structures around the country, and it's important to kind of understand what's going on with interconnection. On this particular issue, the issues are very different inside the RTOs compared to outside, and there's a couple reasons from that, stemming from Order 2003 that I'll describe in a few minutes. But just so we're on the same page about the structure, the traditional structure on the left is you have vertically integrated utilities, generation, transmission, distribution in the same company. And then with restructuring between the 90s and early 2000s, a bunch of states, close to a third or half the states, well, maybe closer to a third, restructured, and kind of the generation was split off into independent power, and you had ISOs and RTOs, which now cover, the ISOs and RTOs now cover about 2/3 of the load in the country. And most are FERC jurisdictional. Those are, and you can see the map on the lower right, all of them except ERCOT in Texas are, and of course the Canadian ones are FERC jurisdictional. And again, FERC put some different rules in place for the RTOs and ISOs relative to the vertically integrated utilities in their functions as transmission providers. But that's just to kind of level set on the two basic different structures we have. And so then moving on to another sort of lens through which to look at the industry, we could put interconnection in the context with other key functions. So on the left there, you see some of the key functions that are performed. Interconnection is one highlighted there. Transmission service is another, where the transmission provider, provides a long-term firm or different types of transmission service. And then resource adequacy, that's where capacity markets are a form of that. Resource adequacy is also addressed in integrated resource planning by vertically integrated utilities. But that's a whole separate function and type of analysis. And then the generation load dispatching that balancing areas provide, often through a market mechanism, which is how they do it in the ISOs and RTOs. That's a completely separate mechanism. And then transmission operations, taking lines in and out of service, perhaps deploying grid enhancing technologies, other operational things. These are sort of 5 separate functions. It so happens that in the ISOs and RTOs, these are generally done under one roof by the RTO, but it doesn't have to be that way. And then in the vertically integrated context, they're all done by that vertically integrated utility. There's some gradations on the continuum there, but for simplicity, there's sort of, we're looking at the dichotomy of the RTO case versus the vertically integrated utility case. And in either case, it's a challenge to make them all work together, make these functions work together. So in interconnection, we're going to talk about how it's not just an interconnection question. It can't be, because these other functions are so closely related to interconnection. Okay, so that's a second way. I talked about industry structure and the functions. Now we're going to look at the whole thing through a different lens, building up our context here. Through the Federal Power Act and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC lens, there's certain requirements that are required for any interconnection, generically, whether it's a utility or a RTO ISO. The legal requirements, of course, and I'm not a lawyer, I should say that, but they are in the Federal Power Act. The rates, terms, and conditions of wholesale energy and transmission service must be just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. So you can, right there, you can kind of read those words and see why we have sort of a first come, first serve type of system. You know, that's certainly one way you can make sure things are fair to everybody. Nobody gets to sort of jump in line. Nobody gets to, you know, get better treatment just because, you know, maybe they're affiliated with the transmission provider, or maybe, you know, for whatever reason, the idea is to be fair under the Federal Power Act for all generators who are trying to interconnect. And of course, that stems out of, I mean, those are Federal Power Act requirements going back to the beginning of the act, but EPAC 1992 and then Order 888 certainly solidified FERC's interest in making sure the rules were all fair to all generators. And so Order 888, which was open access for transmission, was sort of probably the biggest order in the agency's history back in 1996. That was for transmission service. And then they followed 7 years later with the interconnection equivalent, which was Order 2003. And so both of these, Order 2003 for interconnection and 888 for transmission, were, you know, on the right side of the slide here, basically treating transmission as a common carrier, so that every generator had equal access, called open access, with the caveat that the Federal Power Act does carve out generation and bundled retail service for states. So that's how states that have traditionally regulated vertically integrated utilities, those investor-owned utilities at least, are regulated by the state regulatory commissions, of course, making up you know, members of NARUC. And so that service for native load is sort of operates a little bit of a carve out from some of these wholesale rules, but there are some basic comparability requirements. All right, so we've covered a few lenses through which you can look at interconnection. Now we're going to kind of take a walk through history, look at it that way, and 2 slides here. Quickly in basically all the way up until Order 2003, interconnection rules, terms and conditions, pricing, et cetera, was pretty non-standard across utilities. There was frequent litigation at FERC. The processes, business practices were opaque, time-consuming to sort through, very hard to be an independent generator, or even just, you know, a utility generator that might want to connect with your neighbor's system. You didn't know what the rules would be either, and you would probably end up arguing about it at FERC. And there were a lot of allegations and commission statements saying that the commission was concerned about vertical market power, which means using transmission, including the interconnection process, to favor one's own generation. So for those reasons, the commission acted in Order 2003, establishing the basic standard terms and conditions for interconnection service. And that includes the large generator interconnection procedures, LGIP, large generator interconnection agreements, LGIAs. These are all still in place today. You still need an LGIA if you're a generator and want to connect to the system. And the rule also set up particular protocols and systems. And these are some of the things that we'll get to that are starting to come under scrutiny as to whether they still work. Since I was there at the time and helping the chairman draft these rules, I do think they worked quite well for quite a long time, but I'm also the first to admit that that era is kind of over, and we've just got a completely different resource mix, you know, smaller, more distributed units with many, many companies. And anyway, we'll talk about that later. But at the time, all that anybody was doing was connecting gas plants, not even coal or nuclear. It was just really gas. And this particular system was designed with gas plants in mind. It was, and for those reasons, it was a sequential, first come, first served approach. It allowed participant funding in RTO and ISO areas. And by that, I mean, if you're a generator connecting, then even if the last generator didn't require any transmission upgrades, you might be the one, the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, triggering the need for a new network upgrade. So it was an incremental sort of project by project assessment. And if you're the unlucky one triggering that upgrade, that cost is on you. It's sort of marginal pricing, incremental pricing applied to the interconnection case, which was, you know, pretty new for most people had not done that. And mostly transmission service had been sort of rolled in rates, average pricing. But there was I can say since I was there, I guess, there was a political reason for that. The commission, it was no secret, was trying to encourage ISO and RTO membership and participation by utilities. That participant funding policy was something most utilities wanted, and the commission said, okay, well, you can have it if you get into an RTO and ISO, but not otherwise. So a little historical trivia there for you on how we got participant funding in ISOs and RTOs. And that, again, I think it did work well for these sort of, when there were fewer large plants interconnecting on the network. We certainly got a lot of new gas plants developed, a lot of, you know, good heat rate combined cycle plants connected to the system, pretty competitive market in a lot of places. But again, just foreshadowing the story later today, that change. Also walking through history, there are reliability rules. We can take some of that maybe in the Q&A, but the wind industry proactively went to FERC and NERC and said, hey, we need to know what are the rules on voltage ride-through, for example, and proposed something, and then negotiated with NERC, and FERC approved that in Order 661. So there was voltage ride-through. Later, I don't think it's on this slide actually, but later the reactive power requirements were put on wind generators. And then in 2008 and 2012, you know, this is not the first time that there were massive interconnection queue backlogs. There were at least two major rounds of it before, and those led to different commission initiatives, one of which was FERC Order 845, was kind of stepping up the requirements on generators to get into the queue, and it added some transparency. So, queue reform has been a bit of an episodic thing, and we're kind of at that point in the cycle where things got really bad again in Order 2023, which we'll get into, tried to address many of those. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of FERC standards and FERC interconnection policy. Now we're going to look through yet another lens, again, trying to lay the context for the LBNL data and assessments of the problems and potential solutions. Key organizations in interconnection. So let's look at this all through an institutional lens. First of all, the transmission provider is a key entity. It's the one that has the tariff, the interconnection tariff, as well as the transmission service tariff. That could be an RTO or an ISO or a vertically integrated utility. You can also be in like places like MISO and SPP. There are obviously a lot of vertically integrated utilities and an RTO. And in that case, you have shared functions on interconnection between the RTO and the transmission owner. And even in California and the Northeast, where you have utilities generally don't own generation, you still have the transmission owner has functions in interconnection. So the transmission entities, owners and providers are certainly a key organization in interconnection. Transmission customer is sort of looking, the way FERC looks at it, you typically have a provider and a customer, and the arguments usually between the provider and the customer. In this case, the customer is not an end use customer, but it's a generator. It's usually an independent power producer, or it could be a utility generator that's trying to connect. They're essentially seeking transmission service, and therefore the customer of transmission service. So they're a key entity. And then obviously economic regulators in this crowd, key entities. We all love our economic regulators, and that's FERC and the state commissions. Obviously, FERC does not have jurisdiction over distribution interconnection. That's for the states. And in the case of vertically integrated utilities that have not unbundled, then the states have more of a role on the transmission there for bundled service. But wholesale interconnecting IPP generators would still go through the FERC jurisdictional interconnection tariff in that case. The reliability regulator, NERC, comes into play here on some of the reliability standards. And then, of course, end-use customer when we're talking about the wholesale context, we're usually thinking about a load-serving entity on behalf of real end-use customers or like a large buyer. But those are the customers on the load side. So those are the key organizations. Now we'll move to some of the integration of interconnection with other factors. One contributing factor I'll leave to LBNL and others in later discussion as to sort of what's the relative importance of all the contributing factors. But I think most would agree that limited transmission capacity is a contributing factor to interconnection log jams, because all of the arguments and studies are about how much network upgrade is needed. Well, when there was, for example, a big transmission build out right around 2013, you can look at that upper right and see there's a big spike in transmission build out. That's miles of, I'm not sure if you can see the heading, maybe you can, but that's miles of high voltage transmission. A bunch of regions built a lot of miles of high voltage transmission: Texas, MISO, SPP, California, PJM a little bit. There was a kind of a big transmission planning renaissance at that time that for various reasons quickly faded after 2013. But the interconnection queues were all jammed up in 2010, 11, 12, and then all this transmission came into place. Suddenly, interconnection was quick, cheap, and easy. So it's kind of, I think, helpful to put all this in context of, constrained versus unconstrained transmission grids. We've had periods in recent history where we had relatively unconstrained around 2013, 2015, 16. That period, interconnection really wasn't much of a problem, pretty quick, cheap, and easy. But before and after that period, and as we sit now, it's pretty constrained. Why is that the case? I'm sure you'll get different views from different people on that. I think a lot has to do with the planning methods. On the bottom left, there are certain planning practices. These have all been vetted extensively at NARUC meetings and in the Joint Federal State Task Force, where I think it's generally viewed as a best practice that planners should be doing proactive generation and load forecasting, doing multi-value planning, meaning sort of multiple purposes, reliability, efficiency, et cetera. Scenario-based, because the grid is not like assets are not all up and running in the real world, and severe weather knocks out multiple generation of the same type during certain weather events that significantly affects the value of transmission. So scenario-based planning. And then portfolio-based, let's, not just look at line by line, but let's, for consumers, make sure we have the optimal portfolio of DC, AC, grid enhancing technologies, advanced conductors, and do that all in a rational network sense, because it is such an integrated network. And let's find the efficient, and then joint interregional planning. And you can see from this chart, there's a lot of red X's, meaning a lot of regions are not doing those things. So that kind of gets into the FERC transmission planning rule, but that's at least arguably one aspect of the transmission challenge. Not that if they FERC snap their fingers, that would go away, because transmission still would take a while, but it's certainly relevant. And then also relevant in terms of whether the grid is constrained or unconstrained, are quicker ways perhaps to get that capacity to be available. And those could be grid enhancing technologies such as power flow control, dynamic line ratings, topology optimization. Those are widely used in other countries, not widely used here. That's a longer story we can talk about. And high performance conductors, composite core, superconductors, composite core at least, are widely deployed all over the world and ready. Superconductors not quite ready yet, but hopefully soon. You can see this is this chart here is the growth in transmission upgrade, like replacement and upgrade needs, just because of the age of the assets. We actually have a very old transmission system because we built a lot of it 50, 60, 70 years ago. And it's great that it lasts that long, but now, unfortunately, consumers are having to pay for just asset replacements, not even looking at new capacity, just having to replace the old assets, and that costs money. But we do have an opportunity, if we're doing that anyway, reconductoring a line, for example, even with the same towers, or perhaps taking the towers out. We have an opportunity to put new technologies in that can deliver more capacity than just replacing like for like. So that's another way at the time of that replacement to get more delivery capacity, perhaps, than, certainly faster than new rights of way and all the things that go along with that. And then another just sort of context on that transmission capacity is, as I said, in 2013, looking again at that slide up top, this is sort of a map of some of those lines, just to kind of show that, that big transmission can be built. It's not as sort of bleak scene as you might read about in the papers. Sure, I think we need permitting reform. Most people think we need permitting reform, but also, we have been able to build a lot at certain points when we did all that proactive planning and the other types of methods there on the left side. So we don't need to wait for Congress to somehow, solve permitting reform. There's a lot of regions working together through the RTOs or the regional state committees, or implementing FERC's planning rule, where a lot of transmission could get built. Never going to be easy, but it can be done. And this is actually happening recently. So the last slide was 10 years ago. This is some things happening now. Folks in the Midwest are surely aware of the MISO long-range transmission planning effort that was approved. The map of those lines is on the top right there. And then folks out west, certainly in California, are probably aware of the California ISO long-term plan with some, bubbles and lines there, but, investments they're committed to, including both in-state and out-of-state power. All of that is closely tied into resource adequacy in the state. They know they need power, not just at 2 p.m., but all times of day, which is why they're trying to regionally diversify and get, wind from Idaho and solar and wind from New Mexico, which is a different, wind and solar regime, different times of day. So that's, some of the work going on there that's proactive. So there are, nobody needs to wait for FERC rules or Congress on proactive planning. And then last slide on just to sort of, and I'll just close here and see if there's, I guess we'll do probably clarifying questions before we have discussion later, but these are sort of, long-term interconnection requirements that, the Federal Power Act is still there. We have to abide by that. And so a little bit more specifically, that means interconnection processes really probably do need to be timely in order to be just and reasonable. Like just because one set of rules were deemed just and reasonable 20 years ago, if the expected timeline of interconnection was a year or two then under those rules, but now it's 4 or 5 or more, then the circumstances have changed, rendering those same rules that may have been previously just and reasonable to be no longer just and reasonable. So I'm not asserting that is the case, and everybody can, have their own opinion and testify at FERC or whatever on, whether that is the case or not. I'm just saying that changing circumstances can certainly result in whatever was previously determined to be J&R to be no longer so. So that's a real issue, and that's part of why FERC is actively reviewing these issues. Costs also must be minimized to be just and reasonable. That's not a technical legal point, but they need to be, they need to be reasonable. They can't be high, and we've seen the cost balloon for interconnection. You'll hear more data about that. And so, is higher okay? I mean, higher could be J&R, but it also, it causes FERC to review, wait a minute, is this really the cheapest way to go? And is our incremental approach where, each generator incrementally is charged for their contribution, does that, is that causing us to, miss the need for more efficient investments that would make the whole process cheaper for everybody? And if so, maybe we're out of sync with just and reasonable. Again, so costs must be, at least reviewed to make sure that they're lower. There's not some obvious lower cost approach to doing all this. Costs must be predictable and more certain to be just and reasonable. Again, not a technical legal point, but there is an element of uncertainty that is relevant for J&R determinations. If it's completely complicated, and if in fact a lot of problems are resulted just because the generators have no idea what the cost will be, so they file interconnection requests just to get information, requiring everybody to, the transmission provider to study them and require delay and cost, et cetera. That doesn't necessarily seem just and reasonable either. Maybe there's a better process to avoid that prospecting. And then finally, interconnection must be effectively integrated with transmission planning, resource adequacy, transmission service, and operations. These other functions, in particular, as we've discussed, transmission planning and interconnection have significant overlap. I know there's a lot of discussion at that at the Joint FERC State Task Force and at FERC. Again, the FERC planning proposed rule that probably will be finalized early next year may require more holistic multi-purpose planning with those practices I described earlier. And if so, that would likely improve the interconnection process. But again, nobody needs to wait for FERC. Integrating the planning and interconnection processes like California ISO and MISO are doing, an SPP I'm hearing recently with a consolidated process. There are ways to start doing that integration more and better. So again, nobody needs to wait from anything from Washington, which is good because it's hard to get things done around here in Washington. So Elliot, I'll turn it back to you with that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rob. Really great information. I guess, are there any questions? I'd encourage you all to put them in the chat again. We can address them now or at the end of the day here when we have a little bit of time to get all the speakers together. If no one else has a question, Rob, I guess I'll kind of throw a general one at you. You talked a lot about improvements throughout the country and outside of sort of being told what to do at the federal level or even the state level. Do you have any thoughts on the joint targeted interconnection queue between MISO and SPP? And do you think there are other opportunities in other market areas to do something similar?
Yeah, that's been an extremely positive effort. I really appreciate the involvement of a lot of states, both in the MISO side and the SPP side, on the JTIQ investments. And also very happy to hear that the Department of Energy is funding, I think maybe a quarter or a third of the cost of those investments through one of their grants, just because one of the big challenges of transmission crossing regions, or any transmission, is the cost allocation, but especially when it crosses regions. So that kind of work of identifying that comes out of what's called affected systems operation, which I didn't get into, and maybe we'll hear about from LB&L. That's a little bit more like 201, beyond the 101. But very often, if you're connecting to one system, you trigger an upgrade in the neighboring system, and then that's very complicated in terms of sorting out who does what and who pays for what. And then, of course, the process challenges. So, but what happened, to summarize quickly, is MISO and SPP got together and said, well, these upgrades on our seam, on our border, would help projects in both areas. And then the regulators got together and worked out an approach. Now the cost allocation, I think, is still not sorted out yet. There's progress, but it's just hard. But those investments would be massively beneficial for bringing in a lot of very low cost generation to the benefit of load in those areas.
Great. Well, thanks again. We'll continue on our agenda here, and I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Seal. And apologies for the technical issues. I got these new headphones, and what can you do? They don't always work perfectly. But Dr. Joachim Seal is a policy researcher at the Energy Markets and Policy Department at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His research focuses on solar and wind market developments and their transmission interconnection costs, as well as the interconnection of high shares of intermittent and distributed renewable generation into the electricity grid and the corresponding impacts on electricity markets. His past work experience includes stations at the European Parliament in Belgium, the American Wind Energy Association, the Commission for Renewable Energy Development at the Chinese Energy Ministry in Beijing, and the German Federal Ministry for Energy and the Economy in Berlin. Dr. Seal holds a PhD and MS in Energy and Resources and a Master's in Public Policy from UC Berkeley. Dr. Seal, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elliot. And I just wanted to maybe add a few other introductory words. So we are very pleased and grateful that we have the opportunity to talk to all of you today. In general, the work from Berkeley National Lab, and in particular, the group that we are in, the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab, does a lot of work with state regulators. We have a lot of active technical assistance processes going on around renewable energy, and that's our subgroup in particular, but also energy efficiency, overall reliability, demand response, etc. And so We always enjoy working together with regulators, and if there are any questions that may come up over the course of the presentations that you'll hear from me and my colleagues today, please do feel free to reach out to us. A lot of our research is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, so it's all publicly available. We often give webinars about our research as well, that we try to do in an interactive manner. We're here to inform the public policy process and ultimately to serve you. So in that context, it's a real pleasure to be here today with you and present some of our work on the evolution of the interconnection process to the bulk power system. And in particular, I want to look today at interconnection queues and timelines and the costs that are associated with that interconnection process. The work that I'm presenting here today is both derived by me and my colleague Julie Kemp, and then Joe Rand, who has spearheaded our interconnection queue work for the last couple of years. As Rob already explained so well, a lot of the current interconnection processes are structured and follow the rules set up nearly 20 years ago in 2003. And they were really designed back in the day for an electricity system that only had a few large centralized power plants. And even though some reforms have occurred since then, we spoke a little bit about reliability and stability reforms for wind generators. That is still roughly how the system works today. So over here I have a little infographic. In general, there's an interconnection request where a project developer and independent power producer seeks access to that bulk power system, files an interconnection request. There used to be a feasibility study with a new FERC Order 2023 that may be dropping a little bit, but then afterwards there was a system impact study and ultimately a facility study. Each of these studies became more granular and more refined, taking into account new information about the new state of the interconnection queues. And ultimately, hopefully there would be an interconnection agreement, which is a contract between the transmission owner and then the independent power producer. With that in hand, construction could then commence and hopefully then commercial operation begin. Unfortunately, many of the generators who join this interconnection queue and walk through this process are not completing that process. And we're going to walk through some of the reasons over the following few slides. But you can see that at multiple points here in this infographic, there's an off-ramp where interconnection customers can withdraw because maybe the associated costs have become too high, or maybe because they weren't able to establish site control, or for some other reasons. So unfortunately, only a minority of generators make it through this queue, and this large amount of withdrawals then unfortunately can trigger a vicious cycle of delays and backlogs and needs for restudies because the landscape of other generators who are in these interconnection queues has changed. A quick reason why do we do all these studies? Well, the fundamental goal is to determine really whether the existing network, the grid, is strong enough to accommodate these new generators, or whether there are some violations to stability rules, etc., and whether, if the grid is not strong enough, what the necessary network upgrades are that need to be then sheltered for the most part by the new interconnection customer. In some regions, the non-ISO RTO regions, those costs may be distributed among a broader set of shoulders, but where we do have that marginal cost pricing that Rob talked about, it is then really up to the final generator to pay for these network upgrades. Okay, so over here we just have a quick overview of the number of interconnection requests and the associated capacity how that has evolved over time. And you can see that for the most part, from like the early 2000s to the middle of the last decade or so, we had about 150 gigawatts a year, maybe, of new interconnection capacity that's sought interconnection, and maybe around like 500 or so requests per year. But then starting in around 2013, that really changed, and both the number of requests and the associated capacity has really ballooned and increased year over year. 2022 was a slight drop, and that is due to some temporary holds that were placed by CAISO and PJM. But overall, still the number of new capacity that sought interconnection had broke another record, nearly 700 gigawatts of new capacity that just entered the queue in the year 2022. So what is in this queue? Over here, a brief comparison on the left side between the state of the installed generator fleet and the queues from 2010 and 2022. And you can really see how those queues really rose a lot between those 2 time points. And what is predominantly now in the queues are zero carbon generators for the most part, 95% or so of the capacity. There's still a little bit of natural gas, no new coal, but we have some wind recently, more offshore wind now, but especially a lot of solar and a lot of storage. So nearly half of the entire queue is made up of solar, and again, half of that solar is supposed to be hybridized with storage additions. And then we have another several hundred megawatts of 100 gigawatts of storage. When we look on the right side, how these queues compare both to the current installed capacity and the peak load in these various ISOs, we can see that most of the queues now surpass both the installed capacity and the peak load. Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem with ongoing electrification of transportation and buildings. We do expect significant load growth. And a lot of these renewable energy generators do not have 100% capacity credits. So we expect, that as more and more of those renewable energy resources are being built, that the overall capacity footprint will just increase. But so the bottom line is just that there is a lot of capacity waiting to come online. Over here, graph by the various regions, we can see that a lot of the capacity additions really occurred over the past 1 to 2 years in all regions, maybe with the exception of ISO New England and SPP, and some regions in the Southeast where the growth was not quite as strong, but especially in the non-ISO West and in MISO and PJM. There has been a lot of growth in recent years. And again, solar is really dominant in many parts of the country. I spoke already about the fact that not everybody makes it through these queues. And in fact, it's a little difficult to ascertain of those that currently join the queue, what their prospect for success is. But if we look at projects that entered the queue about 5 years ago or so, only a fifth, 20% or so, that applied prior to that year 2018 actually made it online by now. So 72% have been withdrawn. Another 7% or so are still trying to actively work their way through the queue, but the vast majority does withdraw, and that is true for each of the regions throughout the country. There are some that have slightly higher success rates, such as ISO New England with nearly 40% or so, or ERCOT with 30%. In CAISO, only 13% of all projects make it through the queue. And if you look at capacity, not just number of proposals, but capacity, that is even less, just 8%. So 92% of all capacity in CAISO withdraws. Similarly, in the Southeast, about 90% withdraws. And so one consequence of these high withdrawal rates is that as I mentioned already, they trigger all these needs for restudies, which then increases uncertainty about whether the costs that you see in some of these interconnection studies really are the final ones, or whether you may want to stick around a little longer in the queue in order to then figure out what really your final costs are. So want to briefly talk about like two problems that we have with the current interconnection process. One is about increasing timelines, that it takes longer and longer to move through the queue, and then the associated costs of moving through the queue and ultimately building network upgrades, that those are spiraling. Here we look at the time period between the interconnection request and the final interconnection agreement, so like moving through that entire queue. We see that there was a recent uptrend up to 2012. There were some reforms. It went down again a little bit, but since 2015, the median duration has increased again, so that we're now nearly at a new record of about 36 months or so. So about 3 years to move from the interconnection request to the interconnection agreement, and that this is very different from the realities back in 2003 when the rules were first devised. If we broaden our view now and don't just look at the interconnection agreement as the final endpoint, but the actual commercial operation of the new generators, that period now takes even longer, overall about 5 years. And for solar and wind projects, that does tend to take a little longer. Of course, there are some regional variations. Not every region is the same. In CAISO, you can see that the duration is particularly long. ICE New England, on the other hand, seems to be able to manage and get their generators through the queue a little faster. But recall as well, ICE New England had like the least amount of new interconnection request growth that we have seen. So the timelines of moving through these queues has extended as the requests have ballooned. And now we want to look a little bit at interconnection costs that are associated. And so we started out doing research on this about 2 years ago, 1.5. And the motivation back then was really that it was just a critical knowledge gap, and it was really difficult to assess what these interconnection costs are and whether or not they have also increased or not. The fundamental reason for that is that the interconnection cost data is just not very accessible. It is a big information barrier, not just for us as researchers or regulators like you, but also for developers who try to propose generators at various points within the bulk power system. And really reliable information about what the expected costs of connecting to a particular spot, what those costs are, can only be obtained after entering the queue and going through that process and going through all these detailed studies. And even once you have gone through these detailed studies, the costs are often just kept not in an easily accessible format, but in PDFs that need to be, like read, or where data needs to be manually extracted. And so that is just a big information and transparency barrier. Will is going to talk a little bit more about the I2X initiative of the Department of Energy that tried to come up with various proposals to increase data transparency here. But I think, one fundamental takeaway is that many regulatory agencies just don't have a very clear and easy understanding of the current cost dynamics. So what we did is we collected a robust sample of more than 2,500 individual project level interconnection cost estimates. We weren't able to do that for the entire continental US, but I just focused on 5 large ISO RTOs: SPP, MISO, PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England. CAISO, we are currently trying to analyze cluster level interconnection cost data. ERCOT has a very different interconnection approach with a so-called connect and manage approach that results in lower interconnection costs for each generator, where costs instead are more socialized. Non-ISO regions are not included in this data that I'll present today. We're currently collecting costs for some additional non-ISO balancing areas, but in general, that data is a little more difficult to access. We also will only be able to speak about a certain subsample of projects because not all interconnection cost data is published for all the projects that are in the queues. And I had already mentioned that it was quite difficult to get these data. It took about 400 to 500 person hours or so per region to access this. If you're interested in that, we have a lot of the underlying data now published on our website, both on interconnection queues and interconnection costs, and I invite you to look at that if you're interested. Brief word about some of the statistics that I'm going to present. We're gonna the cost data itself is not normally distributed. As you can see here with an example of PJM, there are many projects that have rather low interconnection cost data, interconnection costs, but then there are a few that have really high interconnection costs. I'll mostly focus on the average, the simple average, the mean of costs, and those are quite influenced by these high cost outliers. But in general, many of the storylines that I'll present today also hold when one looks instead at typical costs, so the median costs. They are usually a little lower, but have also increased over time. So what have we found over here is a graph showing the interconnection costs, both of those projects that complete the interconnection process and that ultimately withdraw. You can see that the costs have risen in both cases. Those projects that do withdraw have much higher costs than those that complete the process, and there's some regional variation. For example, New York ISO has recently a higher cost than, for example, SPP. But in general, there is a growing cost trend, roughly doubling or so over time. What is driving this cost increase? Well, it is for the most part the network costs that are increasing. So in general, we can think about like two large categories. On the one hand, the costs at the point of interconnection. Sometimes what we call here the POI costs, sometimes they're referred to as attachment facility costs. And that's just like the interconnection station and maybe sometimes a small transmission line extension or so. And then the other big bucket is what we call the network costs. And these are really broader network upgrades that are triggered by that new marginal generator. That at times may just require modest upgrades, but at times it can really require the reconstruction of multiple high voltage transmission lines over many miles, and that can get very costly. In cluster studies, the network upgrades that are triggered by these generators are shared among all the generators in that particular cluster according to their contribution to the new upgrade needs. But at least in the ISOs that we studied, it is really those generators that are paying for the majority of those network upgrade costs. And you can see that these network upgrade costs have increased in most regions over time. ISO New England and New York ISO are small outliers here when we look at complete projects. But for example, in PJM and MISO, they make up now more than 80% of all interconnection costs. And, especially like among the withdrawal projects, they really make up the majority of those costs. In general, renewables and storage often face higher interconnection costs than natural gas. So again, over here, we look at all interconnection requests. So that includes those that withdraw their application. And you can see that for solar, the costs are a little bit more consistent from one region to another. With wind, there's a little bit more of a dispersion. For those that make it through the queue for solar, that's about 5 to 10% or so of the overall project capital cost needs to be then expended on interconnection. But if one withdraws, that can go up to 40%. And of course, that really then increases the overall cost of bringing that generator online and just messes up the overall economics. And so as in response to that, many of those generators then withdraw. Now, why is it that renewables and wind face higher interconnection costs? If in general, the study process is supposed to be non-discriminatory. Well, the general hypothesis that we have is that many of these renewables are located in more rural areas where overall the existing transmission system is weaker, and that thus requires more costly network upgrades, whereas natural gas is closer to load, thus requiring fewer upgrades. We've tried a couple of analyses of getting at that. And some preliminary investigations here show that interconnection costs in general do increase with increasing distance to high voltage lines. And so you can see a little bit, at least, so for example, here with solar, that there's a certain upward trend further away, particular wind or solar project is located from some of these high voltage lines. But it doesn't really explain the inter-resource variation. Natural gas, even if it has long distance to high voltage lines, still comes in at lower cost than solar. So this in and of itself is not the only explanation. Over here, we have shown interconnection costs of all requests by resource type over the past four years. And you can see that there are some high cost regions, for example, up here in SPP, MISO region, where interconnection costs are just really high. And that's where a lot of wind goes through. So where new wind generators seek interconnection, and you don't see many natural gas generators in the same region. So, maybe that explains part of the cost difference. Similarly, down here in southern MISO are many solar generators with very high interconnection costs, and there are few to no natural gas generators in the same region. So potentially that explains part of the cost divergence. I'm getting here to the end of my allotted time. Just wanted to show you a few brief slides. This is just an example of PJM, where one can really see nicely how the POI, that's the dark color, and the network costs, which are the light color, how those differ by resource type, and that it is really those network upgrade costs that explain the majority of cost differences, both between resource types and then between those that make it through the interconnection queue and those that withdraw. Another brief word, there are different interconnection categories. One can either have a network resource interconnection service or an energy resource interconnection service, so NRIS or ERIS. The first one enables an interconnection customer to participate in resource adequacy markets, and in order to then being able to deliver generator output during times of capacity needs, network upgrade requirements seem to be triggered more than when one just would apply for an energy interconnection service. Those ERIS services may face higher curtailment rates, but they could potentially come with much lower interconnection costs, as shown here with the example of PJM. So a few key takeaways. We have more than 10,000 projects that are currently seeking interconnection. This is data at the end of 2022, so we're just collecting data for 2023, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how much is now coming in the queues. It will most likely continue to grow. We have 1.3 terawatts of new generation and nearly 700 gigawatts of storage. So there's an enormous interest by developers to bring new capacity to with very long timelines and delays, now taking more than 5 years from interconnection request to commercial operation, and very few projects that enter those queues make it through the queues, and the vast majority, 80%, or 70% or so do withdrawals. Interconnection costs are very difficult to discern for the generators that are trying to get interconnection service. The costs as compiled by us show that in general they have grown over time in all study regions, that the overall upgrade requirements for the broader transmission system, those key components that have grown and that vary the most between generators and that ultimately likely move generators to withdraw from the queue. And renewable projects and storage projects often seem to face higher interconnection costs than the natural gas projects. There have been, in response to these crises, a number of reforms proposed. For 2023 was just passed. Will speak a little bit more about that, to what extent that is able to address some of these challenges and to what extent we may need to move beyond that. And I think with that, I'll end my presentation here. I don't know whether we have any questions in the Q&A box. I don't see any, but if anybody else has something.
We just received one, Dr. Seal. Have you seen proposals to make the interconnection process more accessible for non-traditional project developers? For example, community-based project developers or nonprofits. And so as to allow these non-traditional developers to better compete with incumbent or historical developers during RFPs.
Yeah, so thank you very much for addressing this question. So this in the end goes to, I think, a very fundamental concern about equal access to transmission service and really being able to have very little entrance barriers for all kinds of new actors, which ultimately allows enough competition in the wholesale market, but also allows energy justice, addresses energy justice concerns if there are particularly disadvantaged communities or so where one wants to invest, but needs to move through the interconnection process. So I think Will may speak a little bit more about that when talking about various reform options later on. I just want to say that many of the established developers that have a very big balance sheet are both able to just stick a little longer in the queue, being able to pay more of the intermediate payments that are required at various steps through the interconnection queue, whereas a new developer that doesn't have a big balance sheet may have more difficulty paying up those costs. And the larger the entities are, the more refined and sophisticated are their individual modeling processes. So we know of some very big IPPs that have very sophisticated processes, knowing very well likely what the cost variations are, and then only being able to identify locations that are ultimately very promising, where they have a very high success rate. Whereas a new solar developer that may not have a lot of experience, is kind of looking at a black box and facing much more uncertainty. So I think you've touched on a key point there. FERC Order 2023 aimed to make a little bit more pre-request information available to developers. There are some initiatives where ISOs, for example, MISO or PJM, want to publish data about available interconnection capacity at various POIs, which may shed a little bit more information on that, but it doesn't get directly at the cost question. It might be related to available capacity, but in order to really understand costs, one still needs to join those queues.
Great, thank you. I thought I saw someone put their hand up. You can do that again if you'd like, or we'll go ahead and take our break. I'm not seeing it. So yeah, we'll take a break. We'll take 10 minutes. We hope you'll come back and we'll resume at 2:20 Eastern. Thanks again, everyone. Dr. Kemp. So Dr. Kemp is a research scientist at the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Julie focuses on the integration of renewable generation into the electricity grid, specifically the relationships between variable generation, energy storage, and transmission, as well as the interconnection of new resources and solar market developments. Her work incorporates methods from operations research, economics, and data science. Julie holds a PhD and an MS in industrial engineering and operations research from the University of California, Berkeley. She also holds a BS in systems science and engineering from Washington University in St. Louis. So, Dr. Kemp, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elliot. We heard earlier from Rob about this kind of close relationship between interconnection and transmission. And so for the next like 20 or 30 minutes, I'm going to take a step back from focusing specifically on the interconnection topics and instead kind of focus on the transmission side and share a retrospective on conditions and that have led to high transmission value over the past decade or so, and kind of what where we see a lot of value in transmission and what that means. So specifically, just to kind of give you a frame of reference of what we're going to talk through today, first I'm going to kind of give some background in addition to what Rob gave earlier about kind of the role of transmission, and then kind of introduce you to the specific approach that underpins the findings I'll share. Going to talk through kind of what some of those findings are, and then, just key up some key takeaways and get your thoughts and questions as well. There's a lot of work showing that transmission can facilitate electricity sector decarbonization, but it also faces institutional barriers to deployment. Some of these recent studies showing that transmission is one of the keys to limiting decarbonization costs are mentioned here. The specific estimates of just how much costs would be different with or without more transmission varies. Sometimes, for example, one estimate here says that the cost impact is up to like 46%. Another estimate puts it kind of lower at around 5%. Another kind of approach talks about that in order to focuses on one specific legislation and says that in order to kind of unlock the full emissions reduction potential of the Inflation Reduction Act, the pace of transmission expansion needs to double or more than double. And we saw this result from Rob earlier that while transmission spending overall has, increased, a lot of that is on just replacement of existing infrastructure, and construction of new high voltage lines has slowed. So this is just to kind of give us a sense of the where we sit today. And that kind of based on this, there has been some rethinking of the standard approaches to transmission planning. Historically, most transmission investment decisions, are made through these centralized planning processes that I think many of you are very familiar with. Typically, transmission is built to address a reliability or public policy directive. Economically driven transmission is less common. And it's been kind of well documented that in planning studies, it's difficult to estimate congestion. And as a result, there's been a tendency to underestimate it. And, kind of based on some of these learnings over time, there's been somewhat of a shift to using multi-value planning approaches that kind of look at different elements of ways transmission can benefit the system and suggest that if we look at all of these different kind of value streams, that the total transmission benefits are much greater than the production cost savings on which economically driven transmission is typically based. As well, kind of outside of these centralized planning processes, there has been some merchant development, but this ultimately has kind of completed projects. So what I'm hoping to do today is to offer some unique insights into where, when, and why transmission has been valuable. I'm going to focus on an economic type of value that is very market focused. I'm not going to be talking about all those different value streams that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to be, as I mentioned, kind of focusing on what has happened recently over the past decade or so. So we're not going to look forward. Instead, we're going to kind of look back. I'll focus just on the continental US and look at, in terms of our goals, this why transmission is valuable. We're going to look at some of the drivers of transmission demand, including severe weather events, but also looking beyond that. So underlying the results are the kind of structure of locational nodal marginal prices. These maps are showing the average real-time wholesale electricity prices in much of the country, as you can see, and showing it across time. So the years are a little small, but we're looking, in the upper right at 2021 to 2019 on the upper right, and then 2017 in the lower left, and 2015 in the lower right. And so one of the things that might jump out at you first is that there are big differences, across time between the years. But then even if we focus within 1 year, we can see significant spatial gradients in prices, both within a single region, where you might see kind of pockets of higher and lower cost, or higher and lower prices, excuse me, but also have significant differences along regional boundaries. So these historical pricing patterns that we were just looking at can kind of inform how we think about transmission, the value of transmission, based on the differences, those spatial pricing gradients. And so using that historical data, we analyzed 70 links in the US, which you can see mapped here. And these links primarily connect hub, zonal, or aggregate pricing nodes that are representative of kind of a significant area. And throughout the country, as you can see, based on the shading of the links, where the more yellow, lighter colors correspond to lower value, and the darker colors correspond to higher value, we see that a lot of regions have a mix of both high value and low value links. And that we see a lot of high value links, particularly connecting different regions. I just want to note that what we're showing here, we're not mapping the value on individual specific existing transmission lines. We're kind of looking one level up from that in terms of broader, transmission or energy trading pathways to understand the potential that sort of not one specific project between these regions could offer, but rather a more general value that could be delivered by one or perhaps multiple projects. So I'm kind of showing you these values and these figures, but I want to kind of, I haven't introduced specifically like what is the value that I'm showing you here. And so that metric is the mean marginal transmission market value between 2 points. And what I mean by that, it's like a pretty simple calculation. We're just looking at the average price difference between two locations. You can interpret this in a number of different ways. Perhaps one of these might resonate more or less based on kind of your background. Sometimes this value is called the average locational spot price of transmission. It can also be interpreted based on financial transmission right options. And this would be the average hourly payment from holding two of those, two FTR options, one in each direction between the sides of the link. As well, if this link were to be like a specific existing transmission line, this is the average congestion price of that transmission constraint. So just some different ways you can interpret these results. This metric is telling us how the wholesale energy markets value transmission, but that's not a complete assessment of the various benefits that transmission can provide. It's an indicator of the marginal value. It doesn't gauge the different depths of these markets. And, it's not, for example, including the dynamic impacts of transmission investment, which I think are particularly related to interconnection. For example, if we expand the capacity on a specific transmission line, we, will, for some window of time, congestion will be reduced, but often that will also spur investment in new generation along the line. And so there is this kind of a dynamic cycle. Now that you know exactly what you're seeing here, I want to come back to this figure and kind of highlight some trends that we see. And the first is that links between regions tend to have greater value than links within the same region. That's what's shown in this figure in the upper right, where the sort of median market value of an interregional link we found to be $18 per megawatt hour, while the within region links had a value of half that. This could point to what are often referred to as seams issues, as well as just the fact that interregional links are more likely to cross time zones, interconnect weather patterns, and therefore be able to have a greater value. The second trend I would like to kind of discuss relates to the balance of these links. How often we would expect transmission to flow always in one direction, or how often you would expect to see energy being traded in both directions across these links. And what we found is that interregional links are also more directionally balanced than those contained within a single region. In this figure, the value at the bottom, 0.5, corresponds to like a perfect balance of the value from in one direction, say from east to west, is exactly equal to the value when you expect energy to be traded from west to east. And then on the other end, a value of 1 corresponds to that the same side of the link has the higher price 100% of the time. And so we can see, that those interregional links compared to the within region links tend to be kind of more in the direction of being balanced. This kind of result, I think, can help facilitate like interregional or multi-regional transmission planning. Looking at how this value has changed over time, we saw that transmission market value was greater in 2022 than in any other year during the previous decade. We saw that this was true both if we considered the mean value or the median. And by comparing these kind of two metrics over time, we can get at some different types of drivers of value. So for example, in 2018 and 2021, you see really high mean values, but kind of more moderate medians. This is suggestive of that there were regional events that drove, extremely high transmission values locally, driving up the mean, but that they weren't sort of affecting all links throughout the country evenly. Whereas in 2022, as I mentioned, so really high mean and medians, which is suggestive of a more kind of nationwide cause. And in particular, we see based on the lines in this figure, which correspond to the average wholesale electricity prices, you can see that the value is correlated with the prices so that the bars and the lines kind of track a similar pattern. And those high electricity prices is one of those sort of broad causes that can underpin years with both high mean and median values like we saw in 2022. The transmission value that we're talking about here, is a market-specific value. And so, so far we've been focused on the value in the real-time markets, but I think it's worth at least considering how this value could be different in different markets. And so what we're going to do here is compare the real-time and day-ahead market values. What we see is that on average, transmission value is greater in the real-time market compared with the day ahead. That's this dark blue line on top, which is showing the ratio of the real-time to day ahead. So it's higher than 1 in every year and typically maybe like 30 to 50% greater. But this is true despite having slightly lower prices on average. So while between years on that kind of big time scale, we saw that years with higher electricity prices are correlated with higher transmission value. That doesn't necessarily hold between two markets. It's not just true that the real-time value is greater on average. This is true for almost all of the links that we looked at in almost every year. That's what's shown in this kind of dark green line near the top, that in most years, pretty close to 100% of the links had a higher value in the real-time market. So what is kind of underpinning, I guess, this higher value in real time is the fact that when prices between day ahead and real time increase, the increase is usually quite comparatively large relative to when it decreases. So in the dark red line plotted here, we're showing the average price increase from day ahead to real time. Whereas in the light line, we're showing the average magnitude of the decrease from day ahead to real time. So when prices increase, they tend to increase by more than when they decrease. And so that creates this situation where we end up with a greater value in real time. Another important characteristic of transmission's market value is that it's really concentrated in time. In the real-time market, we see that almost 50% of the value is in just 10% of hours. And that's for every single one of these links we studied. For the majority of them, close to 50% of the value is in just 5% of hours. And so this really poses some modeling challenges. It's challenging to capture these conditions that happen, less than 5% of the time. And it also kind of points to that we should be considering a significant time horizon when we're thinking about transmission, because one, these are, long time horizon investments, and then also every year isn't the same. There are many years where, that given year won't even include a top 1% or top 5% value hour. These can be really clustered over time. And it's just maybe worth noting that this pattern is kind of similar to storage, at least in some markets, particularly ERCOT, where I've seen it analyzed, but it's really different from generation level of peakiness. I think this kind of, really begs the question, what is happening during these key periods where we see really high value? And so that's what I'm going to get into next. Due to data availability, these results that I'm going to share are focused on a kind of a subset of the links shown in that map, just those between the ISO or RTO footprints. really excited to share these kind of findings with you all. I think they're interesting. They aren't something that we have, previously published yet. So just keep that in mind. That's why you'll see some kind of like preliminary notes on the slide. Understanding, what drives this transmission value is going to be important to reducing barriers to deployment. And we've kind of narrowed in on 4 key conditions that are present during the vast majority of, peak top 5% of transmission hours with, the hours in the top 5% of transmission value. The first of these is an unexpected event. And how we identify unexpected events when we see big price changes between the day ahead and real-time markets. So kind of something happened that was unexpected in that last 24 hours or so before operation that caused prices to kind of swing dramatically. The next condition is high net load. Cold weather we also found to be, important. And the last is high renewable generation. So if I kind of walk you through this figure, on the left, we're showing the total share of transmission value that's in that top 5% of hours, which as we just discussed is, around or over 50%. Then if we look at what portion of that value coincides with an unexpected event, that's what's shown in the blue bar. But oftentimes we don't just see one condition. Multiple of these different factors are kind of coinciding, and that really amplifies the impacts. So we're showing kind of the overlaps toward the top of this column. Similarly, we see the impact of high net load, cold weather, and high renewable generation. And that together, these explain most of the value, and what's left is kind of this gray bar on the far right, where we're not really sure what's happening. Oftentimes, the impact of transmission is talked about with a focus on severe weather. And, while we did find that that is important, that severe storms impacts can be captured by these kind of more underlying conditions that are listed here. I said cold weather. What about hot weather? We didn't find that hot weather had an much impact on peak value outside of these conditions. So primarily, it just affects transmission value by driving high net load. It doesn't sort of have its own standalone impact. These conditions, are not only important to peak value, which we just saw, but they're less common during times of low transmission value. That's kind of evidence that they are driving high transmission value, not just kind of occurring at the same time by coincidence. We'd be unlikely to see this if they weren't the cause of peak value. So let's just start on the left to walk you through kind of what this figure is showing. In the blue, we're showing how the hours with unexpected events are distributed across different transmission values. So on the far right, we have the hour with the highest transmission value, all the way on the left to hours with quite low value. And we see that unexpected events are really skewed toward those highest value hours. And we see a similar kind of profile, just less extreme for high net load and cold weather. High renewable generation, we also see that it's skewed toward the highest value hours, but it actually has a bit of a different shape and is more spread out over a larger range of value, and is quite significant, not just in the top 5% of hours, but also the top 10, top 15%. Okay, I'll just walk through some conclusions, and then hopefully we'll have time for a question or two. So these are some of the key takeaways that I hope you leave with today. And that's first that we see that there are numerous transmission links with a high market value, but we know there have been few completed merchant transmission projects. This really points to that there is significant barriers to entry in that market. We see that links connecting different regions have the greatest potential and also see a lot of symmetry in the type of benefits. That's that kind of balanced direction that I talked about. This, highlights the importance of interregional planning. I think can help facilitate that, and is also relevant to recent policy proposals. For example, those that want to set an interregional transfer minimum. The market value of transmission is highly influenced by just a few hours during which transmission is really valuable. This is a challenge for planning models that need to capture infrequent conditions, and not just the same infrequent condition repeated, but a whole host of different combinations and different variations of conditions. We see that transmission value is greater and especially concentrated in the real-time market. And that suggests that planning processes and modeling should consider real-time conditions, not just conditions that are present day ahead, and how unexpected events in the last period before operation can really impact things. Finally, that peak transmission value is really driven by these unforeseen events, as well as high net load, cold weather, and in some cases, high levels of wind and solar generation. This relationship between renewables deployment and congestion, I think, is going to be important to continue to follow and understand, as of course that's important for many of the decarbonization targets that have been set. Yeah, like the other work that's been shared today, this is funded by the Department of Energy, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy in particular. I'll perhaps just go back to this key takeaways slide while we can take any questions. I think we have maybe 2 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, Julie. This was terrific. I think we do have a question that just came in the chat here. Can you speak to the relationship between transmission value and the cost effectiveness of demand side management resources?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And one thing I guess to point out is that, what I've shown here today, I haven't looked at all at cost. And like everything in our energy system, it's very interconnected, and there's a lot of trade. You make a change in one type of investment in one place, that changes the different value and opportunities kind of throughout the grid. And I think you've highlighted kind of an important option there in terms of demand side resources, like to kind of shift load or improve efficiency, which could, for example, lower the number of or the frequency of these high net load periods that we saw, which is one driver of transmission value. And so, yeah, definitely incorporating, I'd expect that incorporating, say, more storage, or more demand response, or other types of either, I guess, temporal shifting options would typically reduce the value of transmission, because it's, while not a one-for-one substitution, it tends to at least have some substitution effect. I guess, yeah, if there's another question, I'll make one more comment on that, is that we saw for the interregional links that the kind of direction of value is very balanced. And so in order to kind of replicate the impact of transmission with those type of resources, for most of those cases, you would need to kind of deploy that on both sides of the line. For those places where it's balanced, it wouldn't be sufficient just to say invest on one side and expect to see a similar impact to what you would get for building transmission. For the links where we saw it was pretty consistent, where one end was higher, sort of more targeted one location investments could have more.
Great, Dr. Kim. Thanks again. We'll continue on now. We've got our final presenter who's going to talk about Berkeley's I2X efforts, which I discussed a little bit earlier. And the whole idea there is to look at ways to sort of address some of the barriers and challenges and look at reforms to the interconnection processes throughout the country. Let's see, Will, I'm going to provide a brief introduction for you. Dr. Gorman is a research scientist at the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where he focuses on the integration of renewable energy and the economics of distributed energy resources and the application of energy storage within electricity networks. In his work, Will particularly seeks to inform public and private decision-making within the U.S. electricity sector via economic analysis. Previously, Will worked at the Brattle Group, where he focused on wholesale electricity markets and retail rate design. Will has a PhD in energy and resources from the University of California in Berkeley, and a BS in chemical engineering and a BA in Plan 2 honors from the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks again, Will. Look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Elliot, and thank you all for lasting with us here until the end, the last presentation. So as Elliot mentioned, we're going to bring it back to the specific topic of interconnection for my particular talk. And as opposed to the last two presentations that you heard from my colleagues, Julie and Yo, it is going to go back to a more conceptual, qualitative type of discussion. I'm not going to be presenting a lot of detailed charts or quantitative analysis, but hopefully provide a nice bookend referencing a lot of some of the ideas that Rob introduced early on in our session today, kind of providing an overview, where he provided an overview of the history of interconnection. I'll link back up with that a little bit and then talk about some of the novel ideas that have been floated around to try and unlock some of these queue backlogs. So with that being said, I do want to just remind us, recenter us about Yo's talk and the motivation for why we need to be thinking about solutions here. So this is just a recap. You've seen these graphs before, a little bit earlier, where we have seen pretty significant rises in the interconnection request to a commercial online date, significant rises even within the interconnection study process itself, which is the chart on the right in blue, and which links pretty nicely up with the chart that Rob had showed earlier with the amount of transmission expansion building that has been happening and peaking in 2013. You can see that correlated, especially with these blue, this interconnection request interconnection agreement chart. And then, of course, a lot of the interconnection cost data that Yo showed earlier, showing both for completed and withdrawn projects that we've been seeing interconnection costs on the rise. Both of these trends providing evidence of the challenge of interconnection today. And so this harks a little bit again to what Rob was mentioning, but just providing a little bit of a different spin, in the sense that these interconnection backlogs really have multifaceted drivers, and then therefore will require a multifaceted solution approach. There's not one single silver bullet, in other words, that we really see that has led to this problem. And so, yeah, there won't be one specific solution. So the general sentiment is that we have been asking too much of the queue process that was, for the most part, designed in 2003, though, as Rob mentioned, had been reformed over time. And today reforms are needed given the change in the interconnection mix, so what is being or what is requesting interconnection today, the types of resources, and in some sense the pace of change and the scale by which we're asking the energy system to undergo given efforts to decarbonize. And so what are some of these drivers? As Rob mentioned, and to which I would agree, transmission expansion really has been limited over the last decade, and it's been focused in the most part on local reliability upgrades. And so that bulk grid has not been developed rapidly enough where we have inadequate transmission to take on these new resources that are trying to connect in places where the network does not exist. And that has in part led to these high upgrade costs that Yo have been talking about, talked about, that have been assigned to generators in the queue. Correspondingly, maybe in part to this inadequate transmission is that developers, interconnection customers, started to use queue requests for data collection, basically, which is in part also due to low information transparency, a general low entry to enter the queue. It's a pretty low cost to actually put your name on this list. The high network costs that are most importantly uncertain. So you don't know really upfront what costs you're going to be assigned once you go through the process. And so what does that mean? It means the results that we've been showing of these enormous increases in the number and capacity of projects in the queue. These create important workflow and workforce challenges. how do we actually study all of these projects that we know are probably going to withdraw, or at least a good percentage of them are going to withdraw, especially that challenge, especially when we rely on kind of existing tools and administrative processes. And then the final key pillar here is just a general lack of standardization, a lack of transparent study data, what assumptions are going in to these studies that are evaluating these interconnection requests. And that combined with low consideration of grid enhancing technologies really within those studies and as a mitigation option also contributes to these high network cost assignments. And so we're left with these multi-year queue delays. There's lots of restudies that come with the process. And it's not just a story of backlogs and costs. There's also been reliability concerns as it associates with this interconnection process, and ultimately a bunch of frustrated stakeholders really across the board. So both the transmission providers, who are being asked to do all these studies and manage this process, but of course, the interconnection customers who are trying to get on the system. There's a demand for their resources, and this has been a key gate and barrier to getting these systems online. So that's kind of where we are. Rob didn't talk in much detail about FERC Order 2023, and so I'm going to talk about it here. This was, in many parts, meant to work towards alleviation of these problems that I was just mentioned. And it's very notable that all commissioners agree. There was 2 Republican, 2 Democrat appointed folks on the FERC Commission, at this time, and there was broad support of this, and that was strategic. But as I'm going to go into this roadmap document, which is kind of how I'm going to contextualize this particular slide, is that when you think about solutions and opportunities for reform, especially as it relates to this new FERC Order 2023, it's really important to know and have the context that Rob provided earlier that this reform has been happening for the last 20 years. And Rob went through that history. I'm not going to repeat it here, but a key point to note is that some of the items that existed within FERC Order 2023, items like cluster studies, thinking about first ready first served processes. Some of those have already been implemented by some of the large ISOs and balancing areas. And some of those same large ISOs and balancing areas that maybe had implemented these ideas are still experiencing backlogs and delays. And so where I think a lot of just the industry has landed with this reform is that it is a very important step towards industry-wide standardization. Obviously, not all of the transmission providers across the country had implemented some of these best practice rules on managing interconnection queues, and so that baselining is critical. But there is still a need to go beyond the order. And so the roadmap that I'm going to introduce a little bit later contains a decent amount of solutions that relate and align and are supportive of this regulatory reform, but really we see a need to introduce additional ideas that could support longer-term interconnection process evolution. And so just to provide a little bit more detail about what is within this FERC Order 2023, I've already mentioned these cluster studies, first ready, first served. This is the idea of trying to identify projects that are more likely to be successful in getting off-taker agreements and actually moving towards providing power to the grid. But then also moving away from the single file line that has been historical practice and studying groups of generators in a pool at once. At the same time, there are efforts to increase study deposits and readiness criteria. Those in part go towards identifying this first ready, first served approach. Those are issues that are important for interconnection customers, especially these deposits and readiness requirements, but there's also some timeline, process, and reporting requirements that are being required of transmission providers, and ultimately financial penalties being undertaken if there are delays to the interconnection study process itself. As a nod to data transparency, there was this note of providing heat maps that will show what capacity is available within these different transmission provider regions. Rob alluded to a little bit this notion of affected system studies, which had been a particularly challenging issue in the past, and this FERC order did make some substantial process or improvements on standardizing how a interconnection customer that might be choosing to interconnect in one particular region, but might have an impact on a totally separate neighboring system, given that we have this the electricity system has three main interconnects, though way more transmission providers. So it's this notion that what you do in one location can impact another location. And so there is a more standardized process for how to treat those issues within this particular FERC order. And then maybe the last thing I'll mention is there was a strong push to have greater consideration of alternative transmission technologies. These are grid enhancing technologies that could be used as a mitigation option within the interconnection process. But we do see a bunch of additional possibilities that will go beyond this FERC order. I've listed them here on the right, but we're going to summarize them and talk about them in a little bit more detail as I go into the roadmap. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the I2X program, but really dive into some additional solutions that go beyond current FERC practice. So before doing that, Elliot mentioned this a little bit about this I2X program, but it's worth just providing the background for where some of these solutions are coming from. And that is from this Department of Energy effort funded by the solar and wind offices within the Department of Energy. called the Interconnection Innovation Exchange, whose stated mission is to enable a simpler, faster, and fairer interconnection process overall. This is an initiative for both the bulk power and the distribution systems. Everything we've been talking about today is, of course, on the bulk power electrical grids. That's going to be true about my talk as well, but it's important to know that obviously interconnection is not just an issue on the bulk power system. There are serious challenges and distinct challenges on the distribution system, as many of you all are probably well aware, given a lot of the state jurisdiction when it comes to distribution systems. And so this program has 4 main pillars. You see those listed out here. Today, you've heard us talk a lot about data and analytics. That is in part funded and provided by this particular initiative. But I want to talk about the strategic roadmap, which is meant to inform these future interconnection process improvements. So why did we write a roadmap? Why did we see that there was a need to have a document like we created? And in part, we saw a need because while there is a lot of active work going on really across the country when it comes to envisioning novel ideas for reform, Rob and Grid Strategies is, of course, a leader here, but there are a lot of other transmission provider regions themselves that are undergoing stakeholder processes and trying to develop solutions. The FERC reform process, there's solutions identified that come out of that. But we really felt that there was a need to harmonize and collate solutions in one source that could provide a more comprehensive set of ideas that don't just include queue management issues or transmission planning issues, but might also think about the reliability-oriented challenges that folks sitting within the interconnection process are dealing with. And so that was really the goal and effort, because we felt that once compiled, it would be a strong starting point for discussion. The solutions that we do identify are definitely just a collection of viable strategies, so it's not necessarily a rigid package of prescriptive fixes. And that's really to note that there's a lot of heterogeneity across the country, a lot of differences. Regions have adopted a subset of some of these ideas, and we try to highlight some of that in the document. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but it is important to note that these solutions were informed by a pretty robust stakeholder process, where we had a lot of different meetings, where we convened lots of organizations to talk about these ideas. And a lot of those stakeholders find their way and should identify themselves in the document, because they will need to act when implementing some of these solutions. And so you can see some of those key actors here. These are the key actors, or they align pretty strongly with some of the actors you saw a little bit earlier, with perhaps the addition of OEM manufacturers and software vendors who will also play a key role, in addition to the folks that you might be more familiar with, the transmission providers, regulators, of course, like yourselves, interconnection customers, etc. So we organized this roadmap around 4 main goals that we think kind of center the type of work that is needed to improve the interconnection process. Those are around data access and transparency, process and timing, economic efficiency, and the maintaining a reliable grid. With this first goal, it's definitely near and dear to the national lab's heart, as data is often our lifeblood to some extent. But we also really see this as important to facilitate screening and optimal siting and ultimately automation of some of these interconnection processes. And really, given all of the reforms that are happening, having better data transparency will enable the benchmarking and auditing of those process reforms. For goal number 2, improve process and timing, this is clearly a big challenge today, driven oftentimes by these backlogs and the rapid growth in requests. And so within this section, within all the solutions within this section, we're really trying to balance this trade-off between queue space, this public good that is the interconnection queue, and ultimately maintaining open access, which is obviously a key regulatory mandate, and competition. So there is this trade-off between that queue space, how many people do you let into the queue, and then while also, if you're going to constrain that, thinking about how you still do that in a way that ensures competition. So in this section, we're talking about queue management topics, affected system studies, and workforce development. Economic efficiency, promoting economic efficiency. This is all about right sizing the transmission system. So there's the big acknowledgement here that interconnection and transmission planning are closely related. And so we talk about cost allocation topics here, some of the issues that are probably the most difficult to unpack. We talk about coordination between transmission and interconnection and transmission planning generally. Again, back to some of the ideas that Rob was mentioning. And then also the interconnection study assumptions and the mitigation options that we include within those assumptions. Then the final goal area is this notion to maintain a reliable grid. This is in part to acknowledge that there have been a series of disturbance events that have led to inverter-based resource disconnection over the last few years. And so we wanted to come up with a set of solutions that would provide that foundation from a reliability standpoint to manage and integrate high penetration rates of IBRs. So in this section, we're talking about models and tools that are needed within the interconnection process itself, as well as standards. So I know I'm running, a little tight up against time, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. This is mainly just to give you a flavor of what you will find within the document itself. This is for one particular goal area, this data access and transparency. You'll see a set of solutions that I list here on the left, an implementation timeframe where we think that that solution is particularly important and can achievably be implemented within. And in addition to describing the solution and providing some historical and regulatory context, we also provide these activity tables with different entities that we see would need to play a role in implementing those solutions and ultimately the ultimate success of that solution overall. So that's the general structure of each within each individual section of the roadmap. And so in total, there are more than 30 solutions identified, and I will not have time to go through all of those here. I identify some of my favorite ones or some that I think are particularly interesting that might require ultimately a little bit more research and work, some of the longer term ideas or solutions. Some of the ones that maybe you are already familiar with, or some of the ones that I think are particularly promising, are within the queue management space, really thinking about new or expanding existing fast track options. So you hear there's a lot of discussion about how can we make the business practices of surplus interconnection. So the idea of, for folks who already have interconnection service but might not be using it all, is there a way to get access to that if you are a new interconnection customer? There's also generator replacement approaches that acknowledge that a generator might be retiring soon. They have interconnection service agreements already. Can you fast track a generator through the interconnection process that might be relying on that same interconnection agreement? And then this notion of energy-only interconnection, which is basically this idea of whether generators will have the option to interconnect to the system without paying for congestion-related upgrades, with the idea being that congestion can be managed in real time in our security-constrained economic dispatch tools. And for those who are a little bit more plugged into the space, this is the connect and manage idea. This is how Texas, the ERCOT system, has been dealing with interconnection. Maybe the last thing that I'll mention here is that on the reliability section, one of our goals is to think about EMT models and when EMT models are needed. And we talk about requiring the submission of those models within the interconnection process for all inverter-based resources, but not necessarily using those EMT models until some type of screening criteria can determine when that becomes necessary. So that's an example of some of the stuff that we talk about in the reliability section. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the one slide, and this is my last slide, and it's what I'll leave you with. And when we were kind of writing this document, talking to a lot of stakeholders, thinking about how we will motivate action, given that this really is a multi-actor type of need, is how do we provide a vision for what successful interconnection processes look like? And so we have tried to do that a little bit within this document, and you see that here, where we talk about key metrics, some of which you've been seeing over the course of the day, that we think are important to track and ultimately improve upon over the next 5, 10, 15 years as both FERC order rules are being implemented, but also as new solutions, some of which I've just talked about, get implemented. So this is related to interconnection process time, completion rates, interconnection costs, cost uncertainty up front when you're applying to interconnect into the system, and then, of course, maintaining system reliability. So I'm not going to go into any one of these in any detail, but mainly just wanted to make the point that, you know, providing this vision of success, we see as a pretty important motivating light for folks working in this space. So with that, I'll stop. I think I definitely went, you know, a little bit over on my time, but I know we're now entering the discussion portion of the conversation. So happy to take questions on my stuff, or Elliot, I'm sure you'll open it up for general discussion sometime soon as well.
Thanks a lot, Will. That was a real good deep dive into all your efforts over the past couple of years, and I think really useful information for our members. We did get one question along the way. I didn't want to break your stride there, but I'll ask you now. The way you speak of costs for network upgrades and cost assignments makes me believe at some point the network upgrades that used to be 100% the responsibility of the utility from the POI are now shared or assigned to the connecting entities as well. Is that true, or have I misunderstood? And are you referring to network cost upgrades still borne by utilities?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. You know, it's an important one, especially when thinking about cost allocation. And the short answer is that it depends on what region you're in. So in some regions, the cost is paid upfront by the interconnecting customer, but then over a period of time, there is a reimbursement that happens. So this is what happens in California, for instance. In some regions, like Texas, the costs are totally socialized into some transmission access charge, and that ultimately flows just to ratepayers. But in many regions, it's the case that a large fraction of those network costs are just directly assigned to the interconnection customer. So PJM, MISO, SPP, those ISOs don't reimburse, or at least don't reimburse a significant fraction of those assigned network costs. So this gets a little bit into this participating customer, you know, who pays, cost allocation questions. And those are pretty hairy topics, but there isn't one consistent policy that has been undertaken by the country.
Great. We got one more, a little shorter. How do you take into account RE studies in the timeline?
Yeah, so I guess if I'm interpreting this question appropriately, I guess first I'll say it from the context of our data sets, is that our data, when we show interconnection request to interconnection agreement, for instance, that is incorporating those restudies. So if you went through the process, you got studied, but for whatever reason, maybe someone ahead of you dropped out, and so you needed to go through a restudy. That all gets captured in our metrics, and that is in part, as Yo mentioned, some of these high withdrawal rates, and therefore the studies that have to be redone. That is in part why that timeline has increased, because there have been these more withdrawals, more restudies have been undertaken. So that at least provides context to the data we presented. If your question is whether we should cut transmission providers some slack given those restudy needs and some of the fact that there have been maybe a lot of projects that have left the queue and have made it challenging to really understand what the transmission grid will need to interconnect the folks later on in the queue. I mean, I think that is an appropriate concern. It's a concern that transmission providers have relayed both to FERC, especially when it comes to some of these new rules related to penalties for undergoing those studies. I think there is definitely some concern about how that will all be treated, and I think that is in some sense appropriate. But yeah, anyways, maybe that's all I'll say about that.
Great. Yeah, we do have about 8 minutes here to close things out. Thanks again for the participants for all your excellent questions. If you have any more cross-cutting questions that kind of you want to pose to any of our presenters today, invite you to do so. Either the chat or the Q&A. We're not picky here. We'll take either. Or if you want to raise your hand and ask it live, that's fine too. Otherwise, I'll get all of our presenters up here, including Dr. Seal. And there we go. I guess I can kick things off with a more sort of a general question. Maybe you can you can sort of talk about what's next at Berkeley Lab and sort of related to interconnection transmission challenges. What's next with the I2X perhaps and beyond, and then Rob, maybe you can talk about some of the related efforts that you're working on, and particularly, and as you answer, maybe think about our members and state commissions and their staff and how they can get access to some of these tools, again, as they kind of navigate these issues. So maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Gorman.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of that. I think the first thing to note is this roadmap that I just talked about is a draft version, so we're actively working through comments. And so there will be a final version released in the spring that will be public and available to all. I think one of the big efforts that we're trying to undertake in the future is to move beyond just ISO and RTO specific issues. We try to cover everything in the roadmap, but a lot of the stuff that Yo presented on, especially as it relates to costs, didn't incorporate some of those vertically integrated places, but those also have interconnection queues, they have interconnection costs, and we've really wanted to explore those in greater detail to offer a broader perspective on the challenges across the country, because they can be quite distinct depending on the region that you're focused on. And so we'll be trying to do that within the next year. And again, all of our work reports, the data we collect, that all gets made publicly available. And I guess last thing I'll say is we are always open to conversations with regulators and short, rapid types of technical assistance efforts. So just a note that our doors are definitely open, or at least our phones are open. We probably won't, unless you come to Berkeley. Phone is probably the best way to connect.
Great. Rob, why don't we go to you? Anything going on at Grid Strategies you want to share with our members?
Well, I mean, we're continuing to work on these issues, and we talked to our colleagues here quite a bit about that and the I2X process, but also within RTOs and with a lot of the customers trying to figure out new and better solutions here. For state regulators and staff, I would encourage folks to pay close attention to the activities in your region. Each of the RTOs are in the process of complying with Order 2023 and also looking at potentially broader reforms as Will discussed. So I think we're going to find some best practices out of that. I think there'll be emerging consensus out of all of these efforts, including the I2X effort, and it'd be good to be engaged with the RTOs and the states and utilities in your region on those things. This is going to be an iterative effort. There's not any silver bullet, and there hasn't been any magic solution from FERC. It's all going to take some work over the next couple of years.
Dr. Seal or Dr. Kemp, anything you'd like to add?
I think Will and Rob covered it well already. I think just maybe a concluding remark, we've been talking a lot about like the interconnection processes, but I think Rob at the beginning of that presentation really highlighted well that ultimately it is all connected to available transmission capacity and whether or not that transmission capacity is getting built and whether we're getting ready as a country for the upcoming challenges of the energy transition and whether or not the utilities and transmission planning organizations are actively preparing for that, and with some of these forward-looking scenario-based approaches, looking at the overall portfolio and the overall value. And of course, there are active discussions at FERC on that topic with the FERC NOPR on regional transmission planning. And so that, may come through over the next year or so. And that will be a key area, I think, in which utility regulators should be plugged in and closely following that as well. Because without available transmission capacity, like all these generator interconnection processes that we're talking about, trying to like making them a little bit more efficient, in the end, they can only work with what is available at the transmission level. And at the moment, we've just asked all the individual generators really to upgrade that transmission system for us, because we're not planning actively, for it in a other systematic manner. So our team at the Electricity Markets and Policy Department will continue to release analyses on these topics. We'll have a new version of Queued Up, the kind of central presentation that we give each year on new interconnection trends for the year 2023 that will likely be published in the springtime. And I would encourage everybody who's interested in these kind of topics to sign up. We have an email list where we'll announce each of our research papers and presentations with webinars, and would be happy to have you in the audience there, or as Will said, would be happy to engage bilaterally as well. And other than that, I'm very grateful that you invited us to NARUC. It was a pleasure to talk with you today. A big thank you as well to Rob Gramlich, who joined us today, and I think really provided a very nice grounding at the very beginning to the topic overall.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Really appreciate you all and the time taken, and thanks for the participants that showed up today to engage with us. Stay tuned. We got some additional similar courses we're looking at for 2024. So those emails will come your way. And again, if you have any questions or feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, we'll close things out for today, and I'll thank our presenters one more time. Have a great day, everyone, and a happy holiday season. Take care.
Bye-bye.